All right, so fungi are obviously mostly multicellular. There are a couple of exceptions like yeast, but most are multicellular. They're all eukaryotic. They all have a membrane-bound nucleus and organelles, membrane organelles. They're heterotrophic. They have to eat. They have to get their energy from somewhere other than themselves. They also have cell walls, made mostly out of a carbohydrate called chitin. And we know cell walls are mostly about what? What's their main function? To keep a cell from bursting when it's in water, hypotonic solutions. During most of their life cycle, fungi are haploid, which means each of their cells has only one set of what? Chromosomes, instead of the usual two, like us. They're diploid only during sexual reproduction. It's a little like their reproductive cycle is a lot different than ours. These were some terms that we talked about last time as well. We said saprobes are saprophytes. Those are things that feed on what? Dead things, or decomposers. We know that's the most important role of fungi in nature, is they're mineral recyclers. They put things like nitrogen, phosphorus, sodium, potassium back into the soil after things die. And remember that PHYTE root. We see that a lot. What does it mean? Like a plant. So they're sort of like a plant, but they feed on dead things instead of doing photosynthesis. We also mentioned last time that fungi tend to be made out of these long thread-like filaments of cells called hyphae. And that a bunch of those hyphae intertwine together to make up the body of a fungus, which is called that right there, the mycelium. And I told you over and over again last time, whenever you see MYC together in biology, it means fungus. We'll see that root a lot through this whole talk about fungi. MYC together, fungus. Usually it's either MYCO or MYCE. A fruiting body, what's its function? Reproductive organ. It's a reproductive part of a fungus. We already talked about chitin. And this word down in here at the bottom that you may not be able to see very well, conidia. Those are spores made through what process? Asexual. Which in a fungus would mean what? In a eukaryote, what does asexual mean? What process? Mitosis. Made by mitosis, asexual. And we talked about the different groups of fungi, and we said they were grouped based on what? How they reproduce, their reproductive organs. And we talked a little bit about what each of these names mean. This root asco or ascus means sac. So these are the sac fungi. Their reproductive organs look sort of like little sacs. These are things like yeast fall into this group. Basidiomycetes, those are club fungi. They're spore-producing structures, so little clubs, caveman clubs. These are kind of unique, this group, deuteromycetes, because they don't seem to reproduce out. Don't seem to have any sexual reproduction. Seem to be completely asexual. And the bottom group are sometimes called the terrestrial fungi. These are things like bread molds and orange molds and stuff like that. The only group we really talked much about at all last time was this group right here, Basidiomycetes. Most common group that we know about. Mushrooms are the good example to know. These other things we talked a little bit about last time. Rust usually grow on what kinds of things? Greens. Smuts tend to grow like corn. And puffballs grow out in your yard. They all have a reproductive structure called the basidia. Now that's plural. What would be the singular of that? What would be the singular of basidia? Help me out, English people. What would the singular of that be? Basidium. But they're club-shaped reproductive structures found on the gills. Now remember, we said the gills of a mushroom are where? Under the cap, right? You got the top part of the mushroom. Just underneath that are those thin, light, gill-like structures. That's where these reproductive organs are at. We also talked last time about kind of how they reproduce. We said we don't really say they're a male and females. Usually call them mating strains because they're really not that different. And usually we identify them as plus or minus. We looked at this typical reproductive cycle here. We said that most fungi can do both asexual and sexual reproduction. Here's the asexual part. We have the mycelium, the fungus body, does mitosis to produce these spore reproducing structures. Does some more mitosis here. And that mitosis makes spores, which blow out into the wind, air, water, whatever, land on the ground, land on some kind of substrate, germinate, grow, and become a new fungus. That's asexual. Now the sexual part is the part we want to concentrate on right now. You have hyphae, cells. Let's say this is hyphae from one fungus. These are supposed to be walls. That's a terrible drawing, but you get my point. And then over here are hyphae from another fungus. Well, the board is way off. Eventually, they're attracted to each other, probably through some kind of chemical means. And the cells on the end fuse together. Now, each one of those cells has a nucleus. But what kind of nucleus does each one of those cells have? What did we just get through saying about the nuclei of a fungal cell? It's usually haploid. So far, they're still separate. What fuses first is the cytoplasm of the two cells. And that's called plasmogamy. The joining, G-A-M-Y, means joining, of the cytoplasm. So the cytoplasm of the two cells join together. That gives us one cell with what? Two chromosomes, two nuclei full of chromosomes. That cell, two separate nuclei, is called dikaryotic, which literally means two nuclei, right? Now, not long after that happens, the nuclei fuse together. And that's called karyogamy. Fusion of nuclei. And that's sort of like what that happens in most animals. When the two nuclei from two different cells fuse together. Yeah. Nuclei, when do they fuse? Tell me out. Solids. What about fertilization? Not like fertilization. Sperm plus egg to give what? Oh, give me technical terms. Sperm plus egg to give you zygote. What kind of zygote in terms of chromosomes? Diploid zygote. Same kind of thing happens here. Haploid hyphae plus haploid hyphae eventually gives you a diploid cell. And that diploid cell will undergo meiosis, not mitosis. It'll undergo meiosis. Meiosis takes one diploid cell and splits it into how many cells? 4. 4 cells of what kind? Haploid. And are those 4 cells that meiosis makes, are they just alike? They are not. They're intentionally different, because that's the whole purpose of this, right? The whole purpose of this side of the diagram over here is to create what? Create babies, but babies that are different from each other. That's why it's meiosis instead of what? Meiosis is sort of the opposite of mitosis. These over here, mitosis, what can we say about all the babies made over here? They're all exactly alike. One cell divides into two identical cells. These are different. That's the purpose of meiosis. Takes one diploid, makes four haploids that are different from each other. It creates genetic variation. Those four cells will eventually, or they'll be made inside spore-producing structures. The spores will mature. They'll fly out of the fungus in one way or another, land on the ground, germinate, grow into a new mycelium, which then can either do asexual or sexual reproduction, depending on what's going on. When did we say asexual makes sense? When the environment is nice and wet, stable and good, and the organism, in this case the fungus, is good at living there. Asexual makes sense when what's going on? Sexual makes sense when what's going on. When the environment's changing and the organism needs to what? Evolve, adapt, change. That can't happen without what? Evolution cannot happen without what? Yeah, not so much. Evolution can't happen without what? Genetic variation. And that's one thing that sexual reproduction gives us. Let me take this call right quick. Be right back. Hello? All right, let's try again. All right, so there's a mushroom, lots of different kinds. We mentioned last time that it's really dangerous to try to pick your own mushrooms because a lot of them are toxic. This group, I don't think we talked about, at least we might have mentioned them, but not much. The sac fungi, Ascomycetes.
So is that all I need to know about the mycelium?
That's it.
Mushrooms and how they reproduce?
That's it. The Ascomycetes include a lot of things. Truffles, which I think we did look at a picture of last time. Supposedly a delicacy. Cost hundreds of dollars per pound. They grow where? If you wanted to go find truffle, where would you find it? Under the ground. And we talked about how they usually train what kinds of animals to find them. Pigs. Train pigs to sniff them out, dig them up. They look sort of like dog poop, for lack of a better adjective. They don't look very appetizing, but apparently they taste good. Morels are sort of similar to, a little bit similar to mushrooms. Penicillium, which is the fungus that makes penicillin. It's a good one. Yeast. Now, both of these names next here are yeast names, different kinds of yeast. That's a scientific name, right? Scientific name is made out of what parts? two things make up a scientific name? Genus and species, so Candida albicans. That's the kind of yeast that causes like yeast infections. On the other hand, this next one, Saccharomyces, I'm not sure if you say it Cerevisiae, I'm not sure how you say the species name. That's the yeast used to do what? Make bread or eyes, make beer, wine, those kinds of things. Just look at the name. What does this name literally mean? Saccharose, what would that mean? What about in here? I don't know what saccharose refers to. What kind of eating? Saccharose sounds like what? Saccharin, saccharide, which should tell you it's what? Sugar. And myces means fungus. So sugar fungus. They ferment sugars. Ferment sugars. Later in this class, we're going to have a lab. We're going to actually grow this thing, Sordaria. It'll be a little while before we get to it, but I mentioned that here because we'll grow it later in the lab. These things have reproductive organs called asci. Asci is plural. Ascus is singular. And their spores are usually called ascospores. But we'll look at their life cycle here in a second. But they're the sac fungi. Those are some examples. Their reproductive organ, again, is the ascus. And their sexually produced spores are called ascospores. We might have looked at their reproductive cycle last time. By the way, there's some truffles. Told you they sort of look like dog food. It's on a bed of rice. Doesn't look very appetizing to me. Yeah, don't know. Do what? I've never tried. I've heard they taste sort of like just butter, but yeast. Each one of those little circles is an individual yeast. Remember, they're unicellular. One of the few fungi that are just one-celled. Here's their life cycle, and I think you'll notice this is very similar to what we just talked about in the last diagram. Here are some hyphae, filaments, threads of cells. Two of those hyphae, plus and minus, fuse together. That's plasmogamy, fusion of what? Plasmogamy is fusion of plasmogamy, fusion of cytoplasm. That gives us hyphae that are dikaryotic, which means they have what? Two nuclei, two haploid nuclei. That's what it's trying to show you in here. These cells have two nuclei. But eventually, those two nuclei fuse together. That's what we call karyogamy. And when that happens, they grow into these asci, these sexual organs. So karyogamy gives us one nucleus. One nucleus, that's what kind of nucleus? Haploid plus haploid gives you diploid. That's what we're seeing in here. Here's a diploid nucleus. But pretty quickly, after that diploid nucleus forms, it undergoes what process? What process of cell division happens to that diploid nucleus? Meiosis, whatever you want to call it. And notice that one cell becomes very quickly how many? Four. Four cells that are what? Haploid and different from each other. That's why it's sexual. But notice those four also very quickly after they become four become eight. Because right after meiosis, what follows up very quickly? Meiosis is followed up very quickly by what? Mitosis. And mitosis makes one and makes what? Makes two. So four undergo mitosis to become eight very quickly. Those are going to grow up to become what? Those 8 little cells inside there. What are they going to grow up to become? Yeah. What are those 8 things in there going to grow up to be? Spores. 8 little spores inside a little bag. This little bag is an ascus. This is their reproductive organ. This looks like a sack of spores. Eventually, it'll dry out. Out will pop the spores. They'll land on the ground or some kind of bread or whatever they grow on. They'll germinate. They'll sprout like a seed almost. They'll grow, and then it all starts over again. So one more time, this diagram is really important to understand. We have hyphae, threads of cells. Hyphae from 2 different fungi will meet up, fuse together. Plus and minus, we usually call those 2 hyphae. That fusion of the cells is called plasmogamy. That gives us cells that are dikaryotic, cells that have 2 haploid nuclei. Those nuclei will eventually fuse. That's called karyogamy, fusion of the nuclei, sort of like fertilization. Haploid plus haploid eventually will give us cells, like that one right there that's diploid. That's inside the ascus, this spore sac. That diploid cell will pretty quickly undergo meiosis. And meiosis is going to take that one diploid cell, and it's going to create 4 haploid cells. 4 haploid cells that are different from each other. That's why it's sets. Those 4 cells will very quickly undergo mitosis and become 8. Those will all grow up to become spores. Eventually, this spore sac will dry out and pop, rupture. Out come the spores. They germinate, they sprout, they grow. We get new fungi, and it all starts over again. That's essentially the same cycle we talked about in the other group, the basidiomycetes. It works basically the same way. Here's the kind of fungus down here called the cup fungus. You sometimes see those growing on like trees and things. It's another example of an ascomycete. Mm-hmm.
After eating, I was sitting in the freezer and I was around it. I said, big old mushroom. It was monster. And I was planning on getting down and taking a picture of it before I come back to the truck, but I kind of forgot.
I was thinking about that, didn't I? Turn you to there, Jeff. Nice. Nice. Next group, zygomycetes, terrestrial fungi. These are kind of land. There's a lot of these. Bread mold is an example. Stuff you see growing on oranges. Bluish green stuff that'll grow on oranges sometimes. That's in this group. This name right here, the scientific name, genus Rhizopus, species Stellonifer, that's just bread mold. That's the scientific name for it. Notice though, this is many disease-causing parasitic fungi. There are a lot of fungi that cause not only human diseases, but maybe more commonly diseases of what? It's probably the thing that gets most affected by fungal diseases.
Athletes.
No, non-human things. Plants. You see all these little things that look like shelves growing out of trees? You think that's good for the tree? No, those are fungal infections that are inside, soaking up what from the trees? Yeah, sugar mostly. They end up clogging up the trees. What are the trees' sugar tubes called? Phloem. And eventually those fungal infections will usually kill the trees. It's not a good thing for the tree. So when we say disease-causing parasitic fungi, we're not just talking about human diseases, also a lot of plant, like tree diseases. This word right here is zygosporangium. So that's the reproductive organ, the spore-producing organ of a zygomycete. And their sexual spores called zygospores. So this is the fruiting body. This is the organ that makes the spores. and this is the actual sexual spore. We'll look at the sexual reproductive cycle in the next slide or two. We'll talk about some of these diseases. There are some nasty diseases caused by fungi. There's just regular old bread mold. When you see the bread mold, what are you actually seeing? The bluish, greenish stuff you usually see is bread mold. What are you actually seeing when you see blue and green? Yeah, you're seeing spores. Where's most of the mold actually at? It's in the bread. Are you one of those people that if you see moldy cheese or moldy bread, you'll pull off the moldy part and you'll eat the rest of it? When you do that, you're still eating the fungus because it's inside. You just pulled off most of the spores. Most of the fungus is growing in there, doing what kind of digestion on the food? Nope. Extracellular. It's basically spitting out enzymes onto the food, dissolving them outside its body. That's why they become, moldy foods become wet. Texture-wise. Mushy, gooey, because it's getting dissolved outside the fungus's body. So it can do what to it? Slurp it in, right? Outside the body, extracellular. Yeah, it'd be mostly liquidy, so it'd be more pinocytosis, more slurping. Notice here's that same cycle that we've been talking about. It's basically the same sexual cycle. We have hyphae, or mycelia, plus and minus. They fuse together. Haploid plus haploid. First of all, we get plasmogamy, which is where the cytoplasms fuse. Then over here we get karyogamy, which is when what fuse? Nuclei. Gives us diploid nucleus. Those diploid cells eventually are going to lead to the creation of the sporangium, a fruiting body. And inside that fruiting body, what kind of process of cell division is going to happen? Meiosis. And that's going to take one diploid and produce 4 haploids. Meiosis is usually going to be followed up very quickly by what? Mitosis. So typically, one cell that we start with ends up making how many spores? 8. And those become haploid spores that blow out, get germinated, and it starts all over. Remember that most fungi, though, not only have sexual reproduction, which we see up here, most of them can also do asexual reproduction down here. And what process of cell division is going to be completely responsible for the asexual part? What's the asexual form of cell division? Help me out. We're in the eukaryote. Mitosis. This is mitosis. Mitosis takes one cell and makes how many? 2. 2 that are what? Just exactly alike. All right, our last group, called the imperfect fungi. Imperfect because they don't seem to what? They don't seem to do sexual reproduction. Now here's the thing though. This group is sort of like Protista. What did we call, what did the guy call Protista in the online video?
You said they don't sexually reproduce?
Right. Called it like the junk drawer of taxonomy. When scientists couldn't figure out where something goes, they call them protists. That's sort of how this group works. When they know it's a fungus, but they don't really know anything about it, they first usually stick it in this group. That's why it says it's a taxonomic holding station. It's sort of the junk drawer of the fungal kingdom. If they don't really understand it, they put it in this group first. Usually what ends up happening is that they just haven't figured out how they have sex yet. There's been a lot of things put in this group that later were removed from this group when they did figure out how they reproduced. Candida, a minute ago. What did we say Candida is the form of what? What was that earlier in your notes? Candida. No, that's Canidia. Candida albicans was a form of yeast, which are now classified in what group? Ascomycetes, because they figured out how they had sex. Penicillium is also now in that Ascomycete group, because they finally figured out how they reproduce sexually. But it took a while. So realize that these things in this group either don't have sex, they don't sexually reproduce, or science just hadn't figured it out yet. And this is where they put them until they figure it out. Yeah, both of them, Candida and Penicillium, are now. They were originally classified in this group, though. So again, this is sort of like the junk drawer of the fungal kingdom. If you don't understand it, put it in this group until you figure it out. And remember, the actual more sciencey name for this group is the Deuteromycetes. Deuteromycetes. Now, there's just some examples of edible fungi. Again, you don't want to go out and pick your own. It would be very dangerous. Let's talk a little bit about some symbiotic relationships with fungi. Some fungi have mutualistic symbiotic relationships. Two that you ought to know. Two that the AP people are going to ask you about in one way or another are these two up here on the screen. Look at that word right there, mycorrhiza. We know myco means fungus. What's rhiza mean? You've heard that word before, probably. You might have heard of rhizomes or rhizoids, or it means root. So fungus root. And notice what this thing is. It's a mutualistic association between tree roots and fungi. So these are fungi that grow on tree roots. And notice what the fungus does for the plant. It helps it to better absorb water. If the fungus is growing on the tree root, what does it do to the tree root? What does it increase about the tree root? The root has something growing on it. What increases about the root? Surface area. Makes it better at absorbing water and nutrients. What's the fungus get from the plant? This is mutualism. It's got to get something back. What does the plant pay the fungus in? What do plants always pay in? Somebody said it? Sugar. So they get sugar from the plant, and the plant gets help absorbing water. It turns out there are some trees that can't live without these things. It's very important to the trees. Some of them can't live without the mycorrhiza. So they're fungi that grow on the roots, and they help the plant better absorb water. That's what you need to know about them. Those will come back up again later. But just remember the parts and you know what it is. Fungus and root. A lichen you've all seen. You've probably all touched. These are the little things that look like green or blue paper that grow on the sides of the trees. Grow on top of the bark. They are not a plant. They are not moss. They're a mutualistic association between fungi and cyanobacteria. Which means they can do what? What do we know cyanobacteria can do? Why are cyanobacteria called cyano? They're bluish green. They can do photosynthesis. So this is a mutualistic relationship between a fungus and a photosynthesizer. They grow on the side of a tree. You'll also oftentimes find them growing where? Where else would you find lichens besides the side of a tree? Sometimes they grow on rocks. And we'll talk next time about what this role in primary succession means. We'll come back to that next time. But I want to show you a couple pictures and then we'll call it a day. There's a lichen. Everybody's seen those growing on trees before, right? Part fungus, part cyanobacteria. And then, just to kind of show you where we're going, that's a ringworm. Ringworms have nothing to do with worms. They are fungal infections. Look at that. That's the inside of somebody's mouth. Right here is the uvula. What's the uvula? That's a little hangy down thing in the back of your throat. That's the uvula right there. All that mucus-like stuff is a yeast infection of the mouth. It's called thrush. And we'll come back to the rest of it later. It's a good place to stop.